My name is Eleanor, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 62, and my life flows like a quiet stream, unchanging and peaceful. My home is a sanctuary where the sun caresses the walls, and the breeze gently rustles the curtains. Years of solitude after my husband's death have been spent tending to my garden, which has now become my pride. In the evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of hot tea, inhaling the scent of roses and listening to the whisper of life beyond my fence. But on the day the white truck stopped in front of the house across the street, my familiar world began to crack at the seams. It was a clear morning, one of those that makes you want to linger on the first rays of the sun. I was watering my roses, enjoying the silence, when I heard the sound of an engine. A white truck with a logo on the side slowly drove onto the driveway of the house that had been empty for several months. The driver abruptly hit the brakes, making the gravel crunch. I set the watering can aside and leaned on the porch railing, watching as three men climbed out of the cab. Each of them seemed to be the opposite of the other, but something in their movement spoke of coordination and hidden dynamics. The first one I noticed was a tall man with broad shoulders. He exuded confidence, the kind that makes others involuntarily pay attention to him. His dark hair was cut short, and his beard gave his appearance a stern but attractive expression. His gaze was sharp as a blade, and it spoke of a strength that couldn't be ignored. When he effortlessly lifted a massive sofa, his arms tensed, outlining a silhouette that was hard to miss. Next came his complete opposite. His blonde hair fell into his eyes as if he had just gotten out of bed, but there was a charming carelessness in it. He joked and laughed, and his infectious laughter quickly filled the street. It seemed like the sun was shining just for him, highlighting his playful, almost boyish energy. There was something so alive about him that I felt the corners of my mouth involuntarily lifting. The third man kept his distance. He didn't rush to join the commotion, but his observant nature was immediately noticeable. He adjusted his glasses on his nose and thoughtfully surveyed the house. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, and he held a notebook in his hands. Something about him made me wary. It wasn't a sense of danger, more like a quiet challenge. His gaze, deep and penetrating, slid across the street, lingering on my garden. At that moment, I felt like he saw more than I was ready to show. Unexpectedly, the first man, the one with strong hands and a confident stance, crossed the street and stopped at my fence. I didn't have time to look away when he spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, do you happen to have any extra trash bags? It seems we've run out," he said, his voice deep and calm, with a hint of good-natured humor. I was taken aback but quickly regained my composure, feeling a strange excitement. His dark eyes looked at me sincerely, and there was something unexpectedly soft in them. "Of course, wait a moment," I replied, heading into the house. When I returned with several bags, he greeted me with a grateful smile that made something stir in my chest. "I'm Jack," he introduced himself, taking the bags. "We just moved in across the street." "Thanks, you saved the day." "Eleanor," I replied. "Or Ellie. Welcome to our quiet neighborhood." "Thank you, Ellie. I think with your help, it will become even better," he said with a slight smirk before leaving. I watched him go for a long time, feeling an inexplicable mix of curiosity and anxiety. Who were they? Why did I, who had lived in solitude for so long, suddenly feel that my world, which I had built for so long, could change? I didn't know then that this day would be the beginning of something bigger, something that would change everything. The next morning, I sat on the porch with a book. The sun was already up, and the morning light softly lay on my garden, filling it with a golden glow. But I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to the men who had moved in across the street. There was something about them, about their presence, their energy, that seemed to fill the silence I had grown accustomed to over the years. The noise from the street pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked towards their house. Ryan, the blonde with the playful smile, was carrying boxes and humming something. His movements were light, as if he wasn't carrying weight but dancing. "Good morning, Miss Ellie," he called out cheerfully, noticing me. "Already missing us?" I laughed, shaking my head slightly. His energy was so infectious that I caught myself smiling. "Good morning, Ryan. Judging by your mood, moving is pure pleasure?" He squinted, raising an eyebrow. Pleasure? Well, if by that you mean hauling boxes of Ben's books, then yes, pure dream. His smile widened. But, I must admit, your smile makes it all a bit easier. I felt my cheeks slightly flush, and I turned my gaze to my book to hide my embarrassment. You've already met Jack, he continued, leaning on the porch railing. And if I understood correctly, he left a good impression? Jack seemed reliable, I said cautiously, looking up at Ryan. And is that something rare? Reliable? That's putting it mildly. He's the guy who would jump into fire to save a kitten, Ryan replied, his eyes sparkling mischievously. And I, Miss Ellie, am just a cheerful joker. But you know, being so charming is hard work too. I couldn't help but laugh, feeling his lightness and friendliness sweep away the barriers I had built around myself for years. You really are charming, Ryan, I said with a smile, making his eyes light up. See? You're already my favorite neighbor. He winked, glancing over his shoulder. But I have to warn you. Ben might be quiet, but he's dangerous. Those glasses of his? It's all a distraction. He'll charm you with his intellect, and before you know it, you'll find yourself drawn into a deep conversation about something complex and smart. Sounds like a challenge, I replied, raising an eyebrow. And what about you, Ryan? What do you captivate people with? He pretended to think, tapping his finger on his chin. Well, let's say I'm a master at making moments memorable. And, Miss Ellie with you, I feel like I can outdo myself. Before I could respond, Ben emerged from the house, holding a small box. His expression was thoughtful, and instead of joining us, he headed towards the car. See? He's still thinking about solving some puzzle of the universe, Ryan whispered, leaning closer to me. But, you know, his caring is boundless. If you ever get stuck in a house with a dragon, he'll be the one to offer a rescue plan. And you? I asked, looking up. Me? I'll distract the dragon with my charming smile to give you time to escape, he replied, grinning widely. At that moment, Jack came out of the house and crossed the road. His confident steps and calm expression contrasted sharply with Ryan's playfulness. He stopped in front of us, looking at Ryan with a slight smirk. Are you entertaining our neighbor, Ryan? He asked, crossing his arms. I'm helping, Ryan replied with feigned offense. Miss Ellie said I'm charming. That's important for our neighborly atmosphere. Jack turned his gaze to me, and I felt something stir inside. His gaze was penetrating, almost studying, but warm. Glad Ryan has already made his contribution, he said. If he gets annoying, just let me know. I have a way to make him shut up. Is that true? I asked, trying hard not to laugh. Absolutely, Jack replied, his lips twitching in a slight smile. Though I use his own methods against him. For example, I make him talk about something serious. All right. Ryan raised his hands in a surrendering gesture. You win. I'm retreating for now. With those words, he winked at me and disappeared behind the fence. Sorry about him, Jack said, leaning on the railing. He's a good guy, just likes attention. It's okay, I replied, smiling. He adds energy. Jack nodded, and for a moment, there was silence between us. But it wasn't awkward. Rather, it was filled, as if we both were contemplating words we could say but chose not to. If you need anything, just let us know, he finally said, his voice soft, almost intimate. We're here to help. Thank you, Jack, I said, feeling his words warm me. When he left, I sat on the porch, feeling my heart beat faster than usual. These men were so different, but each of them seemed to leave their mark on my little world. And I couldn't shake the feeling that their presence would change my life forever. That same evening, as the sky began to turn shades of pink and purple, I heard a soft knock at the door. At this time, I usually sat with a cup of chamomile tea and a book, enjoying the calm of the approaching evening. But at that moment, the calm gave way to inexplicable anxiety. Opening the door, I saw Ben. In his hands, he held a small potted lavender plant, and on his face was a slight, almost apologetic smile. I hope I'm not bothering you, he said, his voice soft as the rustling of leaves. Not at all, Ben, I replied, surprised at how quickly his presence dispelled my anxiety. Is something wrong? Not really. He shook his head slightly. I just noticed your garden and thought you might like this. Lavender keeps pests away, and its scent is wonderful. His words were simple, but there was a depth behind them. He held out the plant to me, and for a moment, our fingers touched. His touch was warm but barely perceptible, like a sunbeam brushing against the skin. I invited him in, and he agreed, lowering his gaze as if apologizing for his intrusion. "You're home. It's cozy," he said, looking around the room. His eyes lingered on the bookshelf. "Do you like to read?" "Books are my escape," I admitted, following him. "And you, Ben? Judging by your appearance, you're a book person." He chuckled softly, adjusting his glasses. "You're right. I'm a writer. Or at least, I try to be." "A writer?" I asked with curiosity. "What do you write?" "Various things," he smiled slightly, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "But mostly stories about people, about how their choices change their lives." His words seemed to touch something deep, something he wasn't ready to reveal right away. I felt something stir inside me. It seemed like he was talking not just about his characters, but about himself. We talked for a long time. He told me about his interests, about how he loved observing people and finding inspiration in their everyday lives. I noticed that he avoided talking about himself directly, but each of his answers was thoughtful, as if he knew that every word mattered. When he was about to leave, I walked him to the door. On the threshold, he turned around. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said softly, "for your garden, for your hospitality, and for listening to me." "You're welcome, Ben," I replied, smiling. "You can come by any time. I enjoy your company." He nodded, but before he left, his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. His eyes were full of something intangible, gratitude, admiration, or perhaps hope. Later, sitting in the garden, I reflected on tonight's events. There seemed to be an invisible thread connecting all three, Jack, Ryan, and Ben. Each had their own secret, their own dark side, which they skillfully hid behind smiles and friendly words. Thoughts of Jack sent a shiver down my spine. His strength and confidence seemed unshakable, but behind them lay something else. Too quiet, too calm, as if he carried a burden he didn't talk about. Ryan was light and playful, but his carefreeness sometimes seemed like a mask, hiding something deeply personal that he preferred not to mention. And Ben, his calmness was deceptive. Behind his thoughtfulness lay a storm that I couldn't read. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was high, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming trees. As I passed their house, I heard muffled voices. They were tense, but I couldn't make out the words. I slowed down. The voices belonged to Jack and Ryan, and judging by the tone, the conversation was far from friendly. Before I could take another step, the door opened, and Ryan stepped out. His face was fierce, but seeing me, he instantly changed his expression. "Oh, Miss Ellie, you caught me off guard," he said, forcing a smile. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to understand what had just happened. Of course," he waved his hand as if brushing away my doubts. "Just discussing moving details. You know, it's always stressful." His words sounded plausible, but I noticed his gaze flicker back to the house for a moment, where Jack's silhouette flashed behind the window. "Are you sure?" I asked, feeling that he wasn't telling me everything. Ryan sighed and placed his hand on my shoulder, his expression serious. "Ellie, you're a wonderful woman," he said, his voice low and almost a whisper. "But there are things you're better off not knowing. Just trust us, okay?" His words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but he gently squeezed my shoulder and left, leaving me confused. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sense of mystery surrounding my new neighbors grew stronger. They weren't just men with different personalities. They were connected by something I didn't know yet. But one thing I knew for sure: their appearance in my life was not accidental. And this thought both frightened and intrigued me. The night was clear, but the air seemed heavy. I sat by the window in my bedroom, gazing at the house across the street. The faint light filtering through the curtains indicated that my new neighbors were still awake. Despite their friendliness, something about them made me uneasy. It was as if behind their outward ease lay a complex, invisible web that I was beginning to get entangled in. The next day, I decided to tend to my garden to distract myself. As I was pruning the roses, Jack approached the fence. He was dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, and his usually confident and calm face seemed clouded by some thought. "Good morning, Ellie." His voice was low and soft, but today there was something new in it. Maybe doubt? "Good morning, Jack. How are you settling into the new house?" I asked, trying not to show my tension. He shrugged, leaning against the fence. "Getting used to it. The house is good, the neighborhood too. Though I'm starting to think you're our biggest surprise," he said, his eyes studying me with a slight smile. "Why is that?" I asked, feeling my cheeks flush. "You stand out, Ellie. Your garden, your home, and you yourself. Everything here seems too perfect. As if time has stopped here," he replied, thoughtfully stroking his beard. "Sometimes it feels like this place really lives by its own rules," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "But isn't that a good thing?" Jack looked at me as if he was about to say something but changed his mind. At that moment, a loud thud came from the direction of the house, as if something had fallen. "Excuse me, Ellie, I have to go," Jack said quickly, his gaze tense. As evening approached, the tension in the air only intensified. I tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Something kept pulling me to the window, and I saw the light in the house across the street beginning to flicker. This couldn't be a coincidence. The faint silhouette, "Jack?" moved between the rooms and then disappeared completely. Before I could think, there was a knock at the door. My heart raced and I froze. Who could be visiting so late? Creeping to the door, I cracked it open and saw Ryan. His golden hair was disheveled, and his face was a mix of worry and concern. "I'm sorry for the late visit, Ellie," he began, glancing over his shoulder. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "What's going on?" He came in and closed the door behind him, locking it. The movement was too abrupt, too hurried. "Ryan, you scared me. What's happening?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but inside, everything was trembling. He looked around the room as if checking to make sure we were really alone, then took a deep breath. "I shouldn't be saying this," he began, his voice softer than usual. "But I think you should be careful." "Be careful?" I echoed. "Ryan, you're scaring me." "What do you mean?" "Just—" He ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "We, Jack, Ben, and we have things that are better left unsaid. I can't explain, but if something seems strange to you, just stay away." "Strange? Ryan, what are you talking about? Is this because of your conversation with Jack this morning?" I felt the tension rising. He froze, clearly not expecting that I had heard anything. "You heard us?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "No, just saw. But you both look tense. What's going on?" Ryan looked away, his smile disappearing for a moment. "This isn't something you need to know, Ellie. Just trust me," he said. "We don't want you to get into trouble." "Ryan, you're making me think I'm already in trouble," I said, struggling to keep the tremor out of my voice. He looked at me, his gaze both warm and troubled. "You don't understand," he finally said. "We're not who we seem to be." I opened my mouth to ask another question, but he raised his hand, stopping me. "Just trust me. And thank you for listening," he added before turning around and leaving as suddenly as he had come. The night was restless. Ryan had left me with more questions than answers and a feeling that I was on the brink of something important, something that would change everything. At dawn, feeling resolute, I headed towards their house. This time, I wasn't going to leave without getting explanations. I knocked on the door, and a moment later, Jack opened it. He looked surprised but quickly regained his usual calm expression. "Ellie," he said, "this is unexpected. We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "And please, no more evasions." He was silent for a moment, then stepped aside, letting me in. The house was quiet, but the atmosphere felt thick, almost palpable. In the living room, I saw Ryan and Ben, who fell silent as soon as I entered. "So, you're all here," I said, looking at each of them. "Good. Then let's start. What's going on? Why are you all so mysterious? Why are you telling me half-truths and warning me to be careful? And what does it mean that I'm involved?" Ryan was the first to speak. "Ellie, we really didn't want to drag you into all this," he said, his tone soft but tense. "But it happened." I cut him off. And I deserve to know what exactly. Jack stepped forward, his eyes serious. All right, he said. You're right. We've been putting this off for too long. But before we start, I have to ask, are you sure you want to know? Because the truth, it will change everything. His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I nodded. Tell me. Jack took a deep breath, then began. We're not here by accident. We work for an organization that deals with things most people don't even suspect exist. It's about protection, but not just physical. We protect people from what can't be seen with the naked eye. You're speaking in riddles, I interrupted. Please, be more specific. The supernatural, Ben said calmly, or as people like to call it. We investigate, study, and sometimes neutralize. But in this case, he trailed off, as if he didn't know how to continue. Then Ryan picked up. In this case, it's more complicated. This neighborhood, your home, they're at a crossroads. Let's say, on a fault line between the world you know and what lies beyond it. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying I live on some kind of portal? I asked, barely believing my own words. Not exactly, Jack replied. But your home and garden, they're like a magnet. We don't know why, but something is attracting them. Who? My voice was a whisper. Those who shouldn't be here, Ben said gently. Shadows that cross the boundaries. I struggled to process what I was hearing. It all sounded incredible, but there was no doubt in their voices. I remembered the strange feeling that had been haunting me for the past few weeks. The unexplained noises at night, the sudden flashes of light in the garden. It all started to make sense. Why me? I asked, feeling the anxiety rise in my chest. We don't know yet, Jack admitted. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Or maybe you're connected to this place more deeply